Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Electricity Association's Conversation webinar series. The Canadian Electricity Association is the voice of the electric industry in Canada. My name is Alex Kent, a manager in the Regulatory Affairs and Best Practices team, and I am pleased to be your host for today's webinar. The Conversation series features presentations from CEA's corporate partners and highlights a variety of Canadian and international solutions to current and future challenges faced by the industry. Working with CEA's corporate partners, these webinars have been developed to be of specific interest to those working in the electric utility space, from generation on through to the customer. For a complete list of upcoming sessions, please check out CEA's website at www.electricity.ca in the News and Events section. These webinars allow a broad national audience to participate at no or low cost without the need to travel or invest a lot of time. We are broadcasting from Ottawa to over 25 locations across Canada today. And before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items. Our session is scheduled to run from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time sharp. Questions can be asked throughout the webinar, and we encourage you to do so by using the chat function. So if you have a question, please type it into the chat window, and it will be asked at the end of the presenter's presentation. Please set your devices to mute. And a brief survey will be sent to webinar participants following the session today. We very much appreciate your candid feedback and are interested in any topics you would like to have included in future conversation series. Please keep an eye out for future webinars and events through CEA's monthly newsletter, Current Affairs. With over 6,000 subscribers, Current Affairs is the place to go for Canadian industry news as we connect the national value chain from generation on through to the customer. If you would like to receive Current Affairs, you can subscribe to this free publication via CEA's website. Again, that is www.electricity.ca. Our presenter is Longview Systems, and their topic is, as organizations move to the cloud, the reasons are many, but most commonly it is to offload the burden of supporting these feature-rich yet commodity applications so your employees can stay focused on propelling your business. Regardless, the cloud is not inherently secure. Historically, legacy systems had their computer rooms with a security strategy primarily based on securing the perimeter from the outside world. In the cloud, everything is on the outside and exposed to the internet. All of the same security risks and threat exist in the cloud as they do on-prem, but a new breed of tools and skill sets are required to secure your cloud investments. For our Longview Systems, we have presenting Greg Hartman, MBA, who is the Practice Director in Security. And Greg, I'd like to turn the webinar over to you.
Well, thank you, Alex. I hope everyone can see me clearly and hear me clearly. So just a little bit about myself before we jump right into the topic. I have been in IT or telecom for over 35 years. And throughout my career, I have led and built out 3 large data centers for service providers and 4 national networks, all for national service providers. I have led the development or deployment of over $500 million in technology serving millions of customers daily. Have been responsible for a team that supports lawful intercept, or what we would maybe be more familiar with things like police wiretaps and lawful intercepts on voice and data networks. And all throughout my career, security has always been a focus. And in the last 2 years now, and as a practice director for security at Longview, it's my primary function. And so with that, I'm happy, thrilled to be here with you today to talk about this topic. So what I first want to do is, so securing the cloud is a new breed of tools and skills. And my goal today is really to demystify the cloud for all of us. And nearly every organization is undergoing a transformation or planning one if COVID hasn't already caused this to happen of sorts. And so maybe let's first start off with a couple of myths. So myth number one, the cloud is inherently secure. And I think what we're starting to see in the last probably 6 months, more and more organizations are coming to this realization. At some point in their past, they made a decision to migrate some services over to the cloud. And now they're starting to come to the realization, maybe they're not as secure as we thought they were. There were some famous examples of exploits that have occurred as a result of migrations to the cloud. I'm sure everyone's familiar with Marriott International. It was compromised 500 million accounts. Yahoo, 3 billion accounts. LinkedIn, 167 million accounts. Equifax, 143 million. Facebook, 267. The list goes on and on and on. Another interesting a fact was an insider attack of Boeing that compromised about $2 billion worth of documents and blueprints that were considered to be intellectual property. So that was an insider threat, very significant one. Very significant one. So let's just move on. So for decades, we used to think and design our legacy networks with this notion of the inside and the outside. This idea that everything on the inside was secure, and that was everything that was behind the firewall was secure. And in the old days, employees came to work and their companies provided their computers, and employees used applications their companies provided for them. And it was fairly simple. And today, servers and applications are all on the outside if they're in the cloud. And by default, they're accessible by anyone. And the modern worker works anywhere, anytime, from any device. And there's little separation between home and work, including their identities. And all of this can be secured, but it's not inherently secure. And so that's really on you. Also, what I want to point out here is that what we're referring to is the enterprise network. It's not your OT or ICS network. So I'm really referring to the network that in the most generic. Oh, and I'm also referring to a network in the most generic sense. So it's not just the routers and switches and firewalls. If you're a network subject matter expert, but I'm also referring to the network in terms of servers, applications, and the data. So again, in the most generic sense. Let's move to the next slide. So myth number two, they all want you to think the cloud is about reducing costs, and it's actually about agility. And so the good news about this is that you can turn up and down services really quickly. The bad news is that you can turn services up and down really quickly. And this convenience often causes services to go into production in haste. They're usually not hardened and without any controls. Everyone does, typically after a project like this, everyone does a high five, and then that's when the trouble starts. So let's go to the next slide. So, is it really about cost and agility, and is the cloud secure? Well, the simple truth is it depends. So when we were thinking about our legacy information systems, we needed a data center and we needed special power and cooling, and we had massive budgets that were required to build and support our systems. And about every 4 years, we replaced it all. And we had a team of people to support the infrastructure, and the cloud should be cheaper as all of this goes away. This is no longer a burden on our organization. And so again, in the cloud, we can scale up and scale down as needed. We only pay for what we use. If it's software as a service, no investment is needed in hardware or software. And keeping those systems running is now someone else's problem. So it would seem that there should be a ton of cost savings there. But the savings are really in the economies of scale that the cloud provides by virtue of oversubscribing services across the customer base. So what that really means is that for the most part, many of these servers that were built and deployed by organizations and companies were used, their actual utilization was, 10, 20%, 30% perhaps, and rarely did it ever peak. And so the cloud providers understood this, and they were able to use all of that extra capacity and sell that extra capacity. And so that's where they're making their money. And in turn, they can pass on some savings to you. But again, it's really about agility for you. So myth number 3, moving server workloads was as simple as pick up and move into the cloud. And projects that take this approach nearly always fail. Even if they pick up and move was successful, they have done nothing to leverage the benefits of cloud, and almost always this will cost them more. But my job today is to teach you about security, so we'll get to that. Next slide. So let's think about architecting for the cloud. So understanding if IaaS or PaaS or software as a service is right for you. So IaaS utilizes the data center from the cloud provider, but server and storage and applications is still with you. And PaaS, or platform as a service, goes a little bit further up the stack, maybe addresses the database or VPN and provides that service for you. And then of course, software as a service, well, you're now just the user of their application, but the data still remains yours. So you have to decide what's right for you, and you'll probably have a combination of the above. But do not approach the cloud as simply a pick up your server and drop it in the cloud. It ends up, if you do that, it will almost always end up more costly. You'll need to consider cloud controls, things like logging, backups, access, hardening, and conditional access. Leverage all the great things the cloud can offer: inexpensive storage for long-term backups, as an example, or the advanced threat protections that companies like Microsoft provides, the security and safety centers, as well as geodiversity. So these are all great advantages of the cloud. But plan your financials. A shift from CapEx to OpEx is inevitable, and long-term usage trends and understanding the growth over time is important, because of course your costs that you incur at the time of your migration are going to be very different than the costs that you're incurring at the 1 year mark, 2 year mark, and 3 year mark. You're just accumulating more data and of course more costs. So securing the perimeter is such a 90s sort of paradigm. And really the changes that we're seeing now as a result of the cloud is really, it's more about securing the edge. Identity and access to applications is now the new focus. And so for enterprise networks, the shift is happening as organizations move to the cloud. Now, I want to stress again that this is enterprise. This is not about OT or ICS networks. We'll talk about that in a few slides. But as applications and systems move to the cloud in order to facilitate the modern workforce that expects to access their applications from anywhere, any device, anytime, remember now that those systems are now all on the outside. And so organizations are still responsible for keeping them secure, not the cloud providers. So there is now a shift occurring in the strategies. There's no longer this emphasis to secure the perimeter. Instead, secure the endpoint devices. And it's much more than just traditional antivirus. Secure and protect user identities, multi-factor authentication, or even passwordless systems. And access to the applications and ultimately the data requires conditional access and data loss protection or prevention. So these are all really critical and important approaches and technologies. So this is how Microsoft and the folks at Azure will really view their strategy in terms of securing the cloud. They call it Microsoft's security philosophy in 4 pillars. It's literally what they call it. And so from left to right, we see identity and access management. And of course, using Active Directory at the core, or is certainly at the core of all of that. Then there's threat protection with Microsoft Defender for securing endpoints and servers and even Linux devices. Plus all of the Office 365 advanced threat protection services that are available. And then there's information protection with cloud app security, which is really a CASB of sorts, and we'll talk about that. And then data loss prevention, or DLP. And then there's security management with security layer or logging and telemetry of server workloads, including Defender. And then what I would also maybe consider what's missing from here is something called Sentinel, which is now their new next-gen SIEM, which is offered from the cloud as well. So that should probably appear on the rightmost column. So let's go to the next slide. So very similar. This is the world according to Google or GCP. And this is how Google sees it. And so it's not visualized as pillars, but a very similar emphasis on safe employee devices and detection using systems like Safety Center. User identity, they call out, and also calling out generic terms like authentication and login abuse protection, and storage services for securing information at rest, and the internet communication to secure data in motion. And so again, the emphasis here is securing the edge, identity, and access, even though they present it a little bit differently. Let's go to the next one. Here's AWS. And again, similar emphasis. I wish that they had, something more like Microsoft in terms of their pillars and something a little more presentable. I pulled this from their architecture, reference architecture document. But they're really emphasizing identity and access management, detection, infrastructure protection, data protection, incident response. And so, and by the way, I intentionally left in some text here so I left some text here in the snapshot as I copied it from the AWS document, and it speaks to this thing called a shared responsibility, and I sort of left that in purpose. And all of the cloud providers have a similar statement or disclaimer, and you should really read this. Better yet, as you go back to work, ask your teams about this and see what their explanation is, and then ask yourself if you think your bases are covered. But this is really the shared responsibility between you as a client of the cloud and what their responsibility is. And really what it's doing is identifying that, your responsibility, you have a responsibility here in terms of securing your services, your data, and so on. And their responsibility is providing, the services that you're subscribing to, and not much more. So here's a cheat sheet, and I know it's a bit of an eye chart, but what I'd like to do is, sort of take you through some of the terms, and these are some of the skills that I think everyone should be looking for as they're hiring staff and people in their organizations and teams. And so things like intrusion detection systems, or what we call IDS. And so, what is that? This is really refers to the inspection of encrypted data traversing the network, and it's usually done at the firewall. And so the idea here is that still the number one threat vector is email and phishing emails. And so once a system has been compromised, usually through a phish, or a harmful URL on a website, that hacker has embedded themselves into that user's machine or their device. And one of the first things that exploit does is reach out and connect with themselves wherever they are in the world. And so that's always done encrypted. And so now there's more and more importance in terms of being able to encrypt or inspect encrypted traffic, not just entering your network, but also leaving your network, because that's where the exploit starts. Cloud access security brokers, or the term is more commonly referred to as CASB. And so these are systems designed to manage conditional access. And so this really, what is conditional access? Well, this is really systems that are managing what are the approved applications or unapproved applications that are allowed on your network. What are the approved users? What are the approved devices? And then any combination thereof. And so CASB is controlling that and saying basically, yeah, we know Bill Smith is attached to this device, and we know he belongs, to our accounting department, and we know that it's typical for him to access these systems, and he generally does so from work and from home, and these are the IPs we're commonly familiar with. And so CASB is a mechanism or the systems that control or help control that. Public key infrastructure, and this is not something new, but it's probably more and more important in the cloud. And this is basically a method of tagging application servers with a special identifier that asserts that that server is legitimate and cannot be spoofed. And so that's really, really key. And as users, probably our easiest way to identify with that is, when we're seeing a secure session. For all of us, I'm sure we've done online banking, and we know that we see that little key in the bottom left corner, or up on the where the URL is, and that little key is an indication that that server does have a registered key and is certified. It also verifies that the traffic is encrypted if it's HTTPS. So just a little bit about PKI. Also, identity and access management, or a domain that's referred to as IAM. And this is a domain of how credentials are secured and access to the network or applications occurs. And so, this is actually an area of expertise. A lot of subject matter experts focusing on just identity themselves. They can make a career out of it. Multi-factor or two-factor authentication. And so I hope that most of us are used to that by now, but it's really getting prompted by a key or something that was texted to us when we were logging in, and it's just using some other mechanism, a second mechanism, besides just username and password to log into the network. Network Access Control, or NAC, and this is really a method of enforcing policy on devices entering the network, usually paired with CASB. So that's important. And again, that's an entire domain, and there are people who make a career out of just doing things like network access control. Unified endpoint management, and this is really a system of securing endpoint devices and servers, including malware protection and the lineage of changes and the manner in which backouts happen. And so this is goes far more than just the antivirus that we were familiar with for decades and decades, but the latest UEM systems understand what's going on your system, and where those where some of those malware have been installed, even elsewhere in your organization, and they can help you to trace it and back out and so on. So they've gotten a lot more complex. End user behavior analytics, or an area that's called EUBA, and this is really a system of profiling or baselining what normal behaviors of your employees or your users are. And so, the best example I like to use of this is that, we know Mr. Bill Smith comes in, he works for accounting. He comes in every day, Monday to Friday, 8 to 5 without fail. And then all of a sudden, one day he's coming in on a Sunday afternoon, and he's downloading a bunch of files that maybe he shouldn't be. And so EUBA systems will actually identify that, sometimes alarm on those sorts of conditions. So, and more organizations are paying attention to that, in particular organizations that have a lot of intellectual property that they need to protect. So things like large engineering firms, pharmaceutical companies, and so on. If there's any sort of patents involved and so on, those are usually the companies that are involved in that. Vulnerability management. This is really, again, another specialization, and this involves sort of scanning the network, identifying whether devices on the network have been patched and updated, and if they're current, or if they are possibly, if they have known exploits that they're exposed to as a result of not being patched or so on. And the list goes on and on. I don't want to pick on any one particular company, but there are exploits happening, daily, weekly, you name it. It could be Java, it could be Adobe, it could be, your Microsoft Windows system, you name it. And so it's really important to have a vulnerability management program working effectively in your organization. Web application firewall just refers to a special purpose firewall. I won't speak a lot about that, but really as more and more applications are moving to the web, it is really required to have or really recommended to have a special purpose firewall around web applications or web services. And of course, I mentioned Microsoft Sentinel or Google Chronicle, and these are SEMs that are now available on the cloud. They're reasonably new. I've only been out for maybe a year at most, and if not, or I would recommend, if you're not familiar with any of them, or if you haven't heard your staff talking about them yet, start to pay attention to some of those services. So again, really not an exhaustive list here, but I would say to anyone, start seeking expertise in-house or from partners in all of these areas. These are skills that are in high demand, and they're skills that you guys really need in order to secure your cloud investments and deployments. So let's go to the next slide, please. So what about our OT or ICS network, and how important is air gap? And I actually just copied and pasted this article just last night into this deck. It's a recent story that is out on, came to the, I think it was CBC News that I caught this on, but certainly the feds have also made a bulletin known, and there's a real attention to, state-sponsored attacks against electrical supply, and so I found that interesting, very interesting timing. So again, I'll remind everyone that what we've been talking about so far is really about the enterprise network, and again, the network in the most generic sense. So it's not just the routers and switches and firewalls, but it includes servers and applications and data. But as we shift our focus here to talk about OT and ICS network, really the question here is, how important is the air gap between our enterprise network and your OT or ICS network? And I would say it's probably more important now than it has ever been. And so for many organizations, keeping them completely separate is no longer an option. The erosion to gaining access from corporate IT or even from abroad using the internet has long existed. But there are methods that you can still leverage to secure those networks. And it's many of the same technologies that I just mentioned on the previous page. So things like conditional access or network access control, which was NAC, secured access servers or gateways using MFA and of course NAC. Perhaps even privileged access servers or PAMs is another term that we didn't mention on the previous page, but it's privileged access management from tools from companies like CyberArk or Thycotic or SailPoint are critically important. And then of course, probably the most important advice I can give you in this domain is have periodic audits or assessments and use different companies for these reviews so you get a different perspective. If you continue to use the same consulting company all the time to come in and look, they start to become a little bit, I fear that they become a little bit complacent, and it's like, okay, well, what's changed since the last time we met, and oh, okay, a couple things have changed. Have you done this? Have you done that? Okay, well, it should be all good. I'd highly recommend using different firms periodically, and you get a new fresh set of eyes. So I think that's important. The second piece of advice I would have for everyone is ensure that you have a security incident response plan in the event that you are compromised. This is really, really important. The last thing you want to do is, find yourself compromised and then be scrambling and in the heat of the moment trying to figure out what to do. So have that security incident response plan. Third piece of advice is make sure you have an excellent relationship with your OT supply chain. And, if you need help in the time of a crisis, and, it's those suppliers that are, usually there to step in and help out in those times. So that's critically important, is make sure you have those relationships and support contracts, in fact. And IoT may or may not be affecting you greatly just yet, but remember, if any of the devices that you're deploying in these networks have an IP address, then there's a chance that they can be reached from the internet. So you always want to be careful and cautious of that. It's the fact of the matter is, if there's an IP address on it, it can be reached, and so it always poses a risk or a threat. So next slide, please. So what about our supply chain? What is it? What's important here? I would say set standards for yourself, live into them, and then force your suppliers to also live into them. Once you've got this all figured out for your enterprise and access into your OT network, develop and document your organization's specific standards. Then demand that your supply chain also lives into them. This is critically important. You may be dependent on them a great deal, but it is you that has to stay in control. And so just some closing words about that. I hope this was valuable. Thank you for having me today. Don't be afraid of the cloud for your enterprise transformations. There's a ton of value there. You just have to be careful about what you're doing. And find and develop people with the skills that I mentioned. It is the future. The cloud is the future. There's no question, and so it's important. So keep safe, everyone, and again, thank you. So next slide.
Hi, Greg. Thank you for an engaging presentation. We do have a first question in, and I encourage everyone else on the webinar to input your questions into the chat function. So, what are some of the greatest security challenges experienced for clients that have moved to the cloud?
So great question. I would say that we're still seeing the number one threat vector is phishing email. There's no question about that. And server and application hardening is still a challenge, and overall the lack of controls accessing those systems. And so, what that really means is that, at some point the organization's made a decision to go to Office 365 and all the advantages of that, and maybe COVID sort of rushed that transition just in order to get their workforce, productive and working from home and all that sort of thing. So that's great. It's awesome. But phishing email again is still that number one threat vector, and so encouraging employees to have an awareness around phishing is absolutely important. Have anti-phishing programs in place. I think that's important for sure. And then server and application hardening is absolutely important and imperative. Probably more now that it's in the cloud. Once those systems are in the cloud than they were when they were behind that firewall in your data center. Because again, remember that once you move them to the cloud, it's all on the outside. Everything's on the outside. So hardening them and controlling access to those systems is imperative.
Oh, got a question from Dave. If an organization hasn't really started into the cybersecurity area, what are the first steps to take?
So that's an interesting question. So I think that what you need to do is sort of take inventory of what are the the critical systems that you're concerned with. What are the critical applications? What's the critical data? What are the things we're trying to protect and that we're concerned with? And then I think once you sort of rationalize these assets, what are the risks associated with these assets if they were so compromised and so on. And so I think probably the first step is to start to develop an awareness at in the senior ranks of the organization in terms of what's at risk here in terms of business risk, and then advocating for somebody a leader in the realm of security. And the title we refer to is a Chief Information Security Officer, or a CISO. And so, organizations should have, fairly large large organizations, excuse me, all large organizations should have a CISO, somebody responsible for cybersecurity, and then start thinking about what systems you need to protect and how you're going to protect them. Start developing strategies around that. Start, having the conversations with your suppliers, with your team. Really, I think my best advice is start the conversation. There's an expression that says, you have to have the first conversation before you can have the second or third. And so you have to raise that awareness and start, taking inventory and understanding those assets, and driving that awareness and understanding what's at risk, and starting to put strategies in place around that. And that usually leads to technology investments and some sort of organizational change that has to happen. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does. Thank you. I have a question of one of my own, actually. And I apologize if I missed it, but I don't believe you brought up the notion of white hat firms. So essentially putting a bounty on yourself from a trusted source to try to take your security apart. We're all armchair experts on vaccines now. So essentially the vaccine of cybersecurity world. What's your view on those kind of firms and those kind of services?
Yeah. So there's there are organizations that have all sorts of things. They call them white hats. They call them sometimes black hats, red hats, gray hats. They've all defined themselves in their various functions and their various specializations. Um, you know, I would say that the purpose of those teams and those specialized teams is really to do something called a penetration test, and it's really to try to gain access to a corporate network, or maybe an OT or an ICS network. And so quite often firms will engage organizations to do these penetration tests. I think that there's certainly some value in doing that from time to time, but my advice would be is that before you undergo one of those exercises, certainly it's a novel exercise to have someone ethically hack or try to penetrate your network. But as an organization, you want to be really, really clear about what it is you're trying to prove. Because if you're just trying to prove that you're impenetrable, that's probably not going to happen. I have yet, in all my years of experience, have never found a network that couldn't be hacked. They will always get in. They will always get in. So what you need to start to think about before you do some of these exercises is this a test of our systems? Will we detect it when it happens? Is this a test of our procedures? Remember, we talked about security incident response plans. So are our procedures intact? And how will that play out? And so be really, really clear as an organization what it is you actually want to prove. Don't just go into it with this notion that we want to see if we can get hacked or not. You will, like it'll happen, and so you have to have a sort of a greater goal in mind, I think. So that would be my advice. Great question though, Alex.
Thank you. Got another one from Dave. So hypothetical situation. You're giving this presentation to an executive board, and one of the people of that board says that web applications aren't secure. What's your response?
Web applications aren't secure. Well, that's a pretty bold and generic statement. Web applications absolutely can be secure. You know, I think anyone who's done online banking can find that there's been tremendous success there. Even the banks have had their flaws certainly, but by and large, fairly successful in that regard. They can be made secure. I'm not sure I would agree with the statement, categorically as a whole, but measures can be taken. They can be made secure. It's not unachievable for sure. That would be my response. But you've got to have good qualified people, and you have to have systems in place that are checking and testing and validating that all the time. And changes happen. New exploits are discovered all the time. If you don't have vulnerability systems that are scanning those web servers or web applications, you could be great last week and last month, but tomorrow you're not. And so you have to have those systems always in place, always checking. That would be constant vigilance. But yeah, that would be my response.
I'd like to remind everyone that you can ask questions. I do have one more from me, and it's how do you quantify the agility bonus that you talked about earlier? So you said it's not really about cost savings, it's about agility. So if a client comes to you and says like, okay, like what's that agility worth? Is it purely a operational benefit, or because you are also saving on server time, you're saving money too, or like is there a way for an accountant to really quantify agility?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a tough one, actually. I think, IT for decades has really struggled with, the total cost of ownership and all the math that goes behind, understanding the entire picture of your costs. I would say that, you need to look at, the comparison between, what does it take your organization today to turn up a new server or a new service, and you have to look at it in totality. It's not just the server, the hardware, and the storage, and the applications that's running there, but it's the rack space, it's the computer room, it's the cooling, the heating, all that kind of stuff. And you start to add all of that up and go, okay, now it took us 3 months to maybe deploy a new system. What was that cost? And then if you look at it on the cloud, how can we do that in the cloud? And certainly I don't think it would take 3 months. You could probably turn it up in a much less time, probably a fraction of that time. But now you're going to have to do some new activities. You're going to have to spend more time hardening it. You're going to have to spend more time figuring out how you're going to do logging and managing controls and access and all that kind of stuff. I would say that the agility is really the difference between what the cost was in the traditional sense and what the cost is in your new in the new approach using the cloud. Albeit there's more activities that are involved, all of the governance and controls around that system that's now in the cloud, extra precautions, extra systems to secure them and so on. So you have to look at that total picture.
Thank you, great answer. And I think we're coming to the end, but I do have one more question. And a lot of the cloud discussions are framed as cloud or not cloud. There does seem to, it feels like there's a real binary between someone who says like, I'm on the cloud or not the cloud. But what about, and this is an AWS, this is Microsoft Azure, all the big cloud providers do offer services. So it's like, oh, I have a big calculation I need to do, and I don't happen to own a supercomputer. So like, do you see those kinds of contract cloud events as significant to the utility industry, or it's just too niche?
Um, can you, I'm not sure I follow, Alex. Can
Sorry.
you try to restate that again?
Sure. As the world gets more complicated, there is the greater reliance on huge data sets to make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't necessarily need to make those decisions every moment. One of the major benefits of cloud computing is that it allows smaller industries that, as I said earlier, don't own their own supercomputers to make these really complicated data-driven decisions. But that's just a contract service. You rent server time, you get
Yeah.
someone to run the math, and you get an answer. Is that the kind of service that you see has a niche in electrical utility industry, or no, it's not something that you really see as significant?
No, absolutely I do. I think, I hate to use the term big data because it's sort of been overused in the last 10 years and so on, but, now we're hearing about a lot of technologies around machine learning and artificial intelligence and AI and so on. Um, I'll share with you some experience, that I've had personally throughout my career, and I think that historically, some of these challenges have involved database people and specialists, and they run and query their data, and they're looking for the gems in the data, start to provide them business intelligence and all that kind of stuff. It's great if you always know what question you're asking, and you can run the query and hopefully get the answer you're looking for. But as you start to go into things like machine learning and artificial intelligence, sometimes some of these systems are actually going to show you trends that you were never even aware of. It was never a question that you were asking, and all of a sudden there it is, lo and behold, right in front of you. Through machine learning or AI, you've learned certain trends or certain patterns or behaviors that maybe weren't asking before. And
If I may,
so,
the classic example, I think it was strawberry Pop-Tarts are purchased ahead of hurricanes,
yeah, is that right? Yeah,
something
I
like
haven't
that.
heard that one, but yeah, there's all sorts of examples of that. And so, what's important about that is that, as you develop these strategies and you start to leverage the cloud for some of these things, you get enormous scale by leveraging the cloud to compute massive data sets, and start to do some of these things. Machine learning is now accessible from the cloud. AI and AI ops, now it's all accessible from the cloud, and so it's easy to turn on, fairly easy to turn on, and start to reveal some of these gems for organizations. And so I think that there's tremendous value, certainly for even for electrical operators. I spent a large part of my career, working for a cable company, and we were already examining and learning things about how people were using their network, the internet, long before we even thought about the questions to ask. And it shattered a lot of presumptions that we previously had, and changed the way changed a lot of our thinking. So that would be my firsthand experience with that. So again, it's really about the questions you're not asking and revealing some of the things that machines can actually figure out and learn on our behalf.
Great answer. So I'm not seeing any more questions come in, so I think we'll draw this to a close. First off, thank you, Craig. And to
Hey,
everyone on the line, mark your calendars. Our next conversation series webinars will be held on December 1st and 2nd. December 1st is Siemens Canada Limited, who will be presenting electrical infrastructure for e-mobility. And December 2nd, BMEX will be presenting digitization, a new era for calibration. And if you haven't registered yet, please do so at CEA's website. Again, that's www.electricity.ca. In closing, I'd like to thank Greg and each of you for joining us today. This concludes today's conversation series webinar. We'll talk to you next time. Bye for now.